Very warm welcome to CNN Talk. You are watching us on Facebook. We're live on CNN in the next few minutes. And we are talking Iran today. Iran and United States. Whose side are you on? There's a lot for us to get through. Let's start with Christian, because this is something that you have covered for many years. You know the ins and outs better than any of us here, Christian. How do you interpret the latest moves by the US and by Iran in particular?
Well, let me quote a US senator who's just come back from a bipartisan trip to the region. Senator Chris Murphy went Democrat with Senator Mitt Romney, Republican. And yesterday, as all of this was sort of, expanding, I don't want to use the word blowing up, but as Iran announced what it's going to do regarding the 2015 nuclear deal, Senator Chris Murphy said the following: the United States is currently at war in 3 places: Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And the United States is inching towards conflict in 2 other places: Venezuela and Iran. To me, that sums up the dilemma that the United States is in. And I don't think this is a whose side are you on kind of question. This is, what kind of policy do you think will actually achieve your national security goals if you have an issue still with Iran? How best to achieve your national security goals. And what people like Murphy are worried about, and many others, including Europeans, including people in the region, is that this escalation, and let me again read from Chris Murphy, Trump's Iran strategy is blind escalation. There's no end game, no overriding strategy, no way out. It's just escalation for the sake of escalation. This is wildly dangerous and inexcusably dumb in that order. So I think one has to really consider the history of this kind of relationship between Iran and the United States, and what has produced the results that the West want and what hasn't.
And Jackie, we heard from some European leaders yesterday. They're taking a very diplomatic approach. But as someone who's been in politics, how do you think that Europe's going far enough? Because they're not taking sides here.
Well, they're in a difficult position, the European leaders, because they stuck with the deal at the point at which Trump removed himself from it. But of course, this was a deal that was aimed at removing sanctions. Now, the problem for European leaders is, one, they're now being forced potentially by what the US are doing, but also, of course, businesses to a certain extent will make their own decisions about whether or not they want to trade. And what the US probably quite successfully is saying to businesses, notwithstanding this special financial mechanism that's been set up in Europe, is, well, you can trade with Iran if you want to, but actually, that will have implications for you if you also want to trade in the US. And businesses are going to look to that. They're not going to look to the diplomatic niceties of the situation.
And I'm guessing European leaders, no doubt, will be waiting, instead of just looking at the words and the rhetoric, they're looking to see what the inspectors going into the country to find out what they actually see for themselves.
Well, of course, what they're facing at the moment, this was a deal that included Iran fulfilling all of the requirements. And because if you like, in retaliation to what the US have done, the Iranians are now saying, well, actually, we're no longer going to be selling all of our enriched uranium abroad. We're no longer necessarily going to be restricting our development of the heavy water site at Arak. Then the Europeans have to say, well, unless you're going to fulfill all of those requirements, this deal, to a certain extent, which they'd already found quite difficult, I think, to stick by in the face of the US withdrawing, this deal is no longer in place, which I think, incidentally, would be a massive disappointment. I can remember 10 years ago having briefings about the extent to which Iran was developing its nuclear capacity. And the fact that a deal has managed to limit, it appears from the inspectors, that nuclear proliferation was actually a success.
Do you view, as you're thinking, and do people care, or do they worry? Do they worry, given how things turned out with the Iraq War, at the saber rattling, what we're seeing between the US and Iran, and the potential for war here?
Well, I think everybody should be concerned about it. Maybe worried is going a little bit far. And Donald Trump, when he was first elected, said that he didn't want America to get involved in what he termed foreign escapades. But he now has a national security advisor, John Bolton, who's quite in favour of foreign escapades.
And we'll talk about John Bolton in particular, because this is something that we know he has been front and centre. A very warm welcome to CNN Talk. Today we're talking about Iran and the United States. A year after the United States pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, Iran says it will stop complying with some measures of the agreement unless Europe steps in to stop it, protect, I should say, from sanctions. Take a look at this.
The U.S. is doubling down on its maximum pressure campaign with the new offensive against Iran's economy.
I felt compelled to authorize new sanctions on Iran's iron, steel, aluminum, and copper industries.
The move came just hours after Iran said it would begin stockpiling enriched uranium.
We will not allow the United States of America to turn this win-win agreement into a win-lose agreement for us.
He's giving the other signatories a deadline, a 60-day deadline to ease the pressure caused by U.S. sanctions.
And the U.S. says that more sanctions are coming. They're not stopping here.
Iran's decision to depart from the JCPOA for us mostly is about their decision to work on their nuclear program.
Unlike the USA, which has pulled out of it, we have not pulled out of the agreement.
This comes as a Navy strike group is heading towards the Strait of Hormuz.
Is this strategy of building pressure on Iran going to work?
It really makes me wonder whether they actually want Iran to come back to the negotiating table.
And that's a very good question indeed. And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? The question we're asking, Iran versus United States, you see on your screen. Whose side are you on? Join the conversation, facebook.com/CNNI. Tell us where you are writing from. We'll read your comments on air. We're joined by very familiar faces here on the show. We've got Ian, we've got Jackie Smith, Stig, as well as Christian Amanpour. And Christian, I want to start with you first, because this is something that you've covered for us for a long, long time, in fact. And you know this better than any of us here. Did you ever think that we would get to this point?
I mean, yes, under the Trump administration, because he started his campaign saying that this was the worst deal he'd ever seen and that he was going to pull the U.S. out of it. So he's kept that promise. Yeah. The bottom line is, though, was he right? And we have been told, and for instance, President Obama was told by his predecessor, George W. Bush, that the thing you have to do is make sure Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon. What did President Obama do? He took that seriously. And up to the sanctions on Iran, got a whole sort of unprecedented global sanctions. Then Rouhani was elected in Tehran. That brought the whole lot to the table. And what did they do? They put a ring fence around the one issue that the world said was the existential worry for Israel, for the region, for the West, and all the rest of it. They got it done. This was never going to be a process. And it was said from the outset of putting the whole basket of problems that Iran has on the table at that time. They knew that they wouldn't get that. So now we're being told that perfect is the enemy of the good. So let's throw out the good, which is containing Iran's nuclear development, and open a can of worms again. And your mashup that you just had really does remind me, since I covered it as well, of the lead up and the war in Iraq in 2002. Why? Because what we have is a U.S. administration declaring things like Pompeo, that Iran has pulled out of the deal. No, it hasn't. No, and Pompeo said that here in London yesterday. No, it hasn't. They're sending a battle group aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf, and they have what they call a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, which has been in effect for the last year. Iran has had a maximum patience campaign where it sat on its hands, but now it's saying, well, you know, we also have domestic politics, and we need to say a few things, and you Europeans have not been able to mitigate the pain that we're getting. We are complying with the deal. The inspectors say we're complying with the deal. It's not a U.S. deal. It's a UN enshrined deal. I mean, all of this is very, very difficult to see where it's going to end up. Let me just show our audience what the U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton tweeted. He tweeted this yesterday. The United States will continue its maximum pressure on the Iranian regime until its leaders decide to change the destructive behaviour, respect the rights of the Iranian people, and return to negotiating table. And then we heard this from the EU, because the EU now is a situation where who do you side with? This is what the EU had to say. We reject any ultimatums and will assess Iran's compliance on the basis of Iran's performance regarding its nuclear-related commitments. And then it went on to say this on the question of sanctions. We regret the reimposition of sanctions by the United States following their withdrawal from the agreement. So, Jackie, how do you interpret those two agreements? Because it seems to me that they are against the threat, the ultimatum from Iran, but also not actually turning their back on this nuclear deal at all.
Well, Christiane is right. Of course, the 10 years ago when I was in government, I was briefed about the significant threat from Iran in relation to their potential development of nuclear weaponry capacity. And the deal was limited to a certain extent, but pretty groundbreaking ability to be able to limit that development, to limit the ability of the Iranians to develop the wherewithal to build weapons, and to ensure that the inspectors were there to make sure that that was happening.
And you can talk more about this, because Jackie, this is the nuclear deal. These are the key points of the agreement. Deal lifts economic sanction in exchange for nuclear controls, agrees to cut centrifuges by 2/3. Tehran agrees to cut enriched uranium stockpiles. So this is the crux of the agreement. Would you say that Iran has stuck to that agreement?
Well, I think up to this point, the Iranians have stuck to it, yes. But of course, when the US withdrew from it a year ago and reimposed sanctions, because of course, what brought Iran to the table was the wish to be able to trade its oil and, in fact, to a certain extent, the metals, about which Trump has also reimposed sanctions now, and the benefit, therefore, of its people. Now, what the Iranian people are now suffering from is a quadrupling of their rate of inflation, the reduction in the value of their currency, and so, of course, there is a domestic audience as well that the Iranian leaders need to confront, given what's happened over the last year. And that's forcing them, if you like, to threaten, to make some limited reductions in their commitments to the deal and to try and get the Europeans to support them, particularly in that economic area.
Ian, is the US being deliberately provocative here?
I think that's a rhetorical question.
It was,
yes,
but I had to ask.
Of course they are, and they're using every power that they have, and sending this aircraft carrier is all part of that. The crunch is not going to come in the next couple of weeks. The crunch is going to come in 60 days' time, when the Iranian self-imposed deadline, that they've said if the Europeans haven't persuaded America to effectively reverse its decision by then the Europeans are going to have to choose sides. And if they don't choose the American side, Trump will then have to decide, is he actually going to put sanctions on his own allies? I mean, this could escalate beyond, I mean, forget military action. There's huge implications here for various economies. You've got China. So actually, instead of reducing its oil imports from Iran, as Trump asked them to do, they've actually increased their imports from Iran. So they're kind of coming to Iran's aid to a certain extent. But let's not underestimate the weakness of the Iranian economy. And Christiane will know more about this than I do. But I mean, I read that the Iranian people are sort of in a state of incandescence about the way their economy is being run. So Trump's idea will weaken the economy, the people will rise up, and it'll all be all right.
And we'll talk about the economy. I'll come to you in just a minute, Stig, because I want to go to our John Defterios, because he's been covering the economic side of this story. And John, the Iranian economy really has contracted quite severely. And now we've got more sanctions coming from the United States.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif was suggesting that this is a war crime against Iran because they did not pull out of the nuclear agreement. It's unilateral action from the United States. Now, the Iranians are going to try to put a very brave face on it. We heard from President Hassan Rouhani saying this win-win is not going to turn into a win-lose, but the reality is quite different, and I'll explain why. The latest industrial sanctions are quite severe against Iran because it is a major industrial player. Top 10 in terms of steel exports right now, top 15 when it comes to autos around the world. This targets iron, steel, copper, and aluminum. So it is like a big wrench. I think it's a good analogy where the U.S. pulls out the wrench and then tightens the bolts on the Iranian economy. But the number one target, and this came up during the conversation you're having here on the roundtable, is the energy sector. And we can take a look at the exports of Iran in March of 2019, hovering around 1 million barrels a day. And then I like to talk about the halo effect of the nuclear agreement in the autumn of 2016. Look at that number, 3 million barrels a day. The sanctions by the U.S. on the energy sector could cost Iran about $50 billion a year. I'm watching China very carefully, also Turkey. Combined, they represent about 800,000 barrels a day of imports of Iranian crude. So far, they've stayed with the Iranians. India, South Korea, Japan have jumped off the Iranian ship, if you will. The International Monetary Fund is suggesting, these are updated numbers from about 10 days ago, that the Iranian economy will contract by 6% this year after falling about 4% last year. But the author of that report told me face to face, we've calculated that on Iran holding up its exports to about 1 million barrels a day. It could get much worse. We talked about the rial, the Iranian rial. When it goes down like it has done, and it's at a 7-month low, it means that imported goods skyrocket. So inflation is running at 40%. And again, we haven't seen the worst of it. Now, there's another quite nasty game that the U.S. is playing right now, and that's trying to cozy up with Iraq. They have a $50 billion oil deal on the table with Iraq, and they're trying to serve as a wedge between Iran and Iraq at this stage. 2003 war, 16 years later, ExxonMobil, along with PetroChina, are trying to sign this deal in the next month. It's pretty substantial and a pretty nasty game when it comes to economics and geopolitics.
Yeah, and those in Iran will be feeling it. Thank you very much, John. Stig, how much is the United States, do you think, from what we just heard from John, really trying to squeeze Iran here any way it can?
I think there's a slight danger we enter into a bit of an intellectual farce when we pretend that there's a strategy. Because that quote that you read from the tweet from Chris,
Trump's Iran strategy is blind escalation. There's no end game, no overriding strategy, no way out. Just escalation for the sake of escalation. That's wildly dangerous and inexcusably dumb in that order. That is
Actually,
a U.S. senator who has just been to the region.
And, there is that tweet that Christian was just...
And that seems to me to be an indisputable argument that this, Trump's objection to the deal isn't about geopolitics, it's not about economics, it's about the fact that it was done by his predecessor. The whole idea that history is written by the stories of great men, it's about the history of madmen that we are now...
Is it just that?
I'm not sure it's that. I feel he's got a hawk alongside him. He is not governed, in my view. Nothing he has behaved over the last 2 years would suggest he is weighing up carefully calibrated arguments about the geopolitics of the area. He operates, to me, it seems, on emotion and gut feel. So the notion that there is an end game, that there is the word strategy in connection with this feels like a disservice to the English language. This doesn't feel like strategic behaviour from the US.
Go ahead.
I mean, I agree it's not strategic, but is there an element of this which is about saying, look, to the extent that he has a view of that part of the world, his friends would be the Saudis and would be the Israelis, and clearly, my enemy's friends are my friends.
Go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, Javad Zarif, who's the foreign minister of Iran, is very, very facile with the English language and actually quite an expert at it, has named the Trump strategy the B team.
And here's that tweet.
This is the tweet. He's talked about, well, that is not it. The B team is, or he said is added again. But what is the B team? The B team is John Bolton, Bibi Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, etc. That's part of it. But the other legitimate issue from the United States perspective, and even from Europe's perspective, is what about Iran's other nefarious activities, whether it's in Syria, whether it's with Hezbollah, wherever it might be. Those are all legitimate questions to want to address. But, and this is the but, do you address that by trying to get them to surrender and cry uncle, and in the meantime throwing out the deal that actually contains what the whole world said was the existential threat, and that's the nuclear threat.
So a lot of carrot and not much stick then in that
And what does good look like? I mean, are we saying that Trump wants to come back to the table and redo this deal? Is that really the aim of this? Or are we trying to solve...
That's what he says.
There was also the tweet earlier from Bolton saying, talk about the oppression of the Iranian people. Is America now interested in the oppression of people within the Arab states? Because it might want to talk to Saudi Arabia about that as well.
I mean,
that's what it said.
Bill Clinton talked about that, George W. Bush talked about that, Obama talked about that, so that's nothing particularly new. But let me preface this question to you, Christian, by saying, broadly, I'm pro-Israel. Do you not think that this policy is being driven by Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think Benjamin Netanyahu, yes, but also the other Gulf states who I just said, most definitely Saudi Arabia and most definitely the UAE. Certainly Benjamin Netanyahu's had a real issue with Iran for all his time in office. But let's just take this very, very carefully. For the last several years, during Iran's intervention in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime, there have been moments when the Israelis have intervened and conducted airstrikes and probably stuff on the ground as well against Iranian assets and Iranian concentrations and objectives. Something in the region of 200 such interventions against Iran in Syria over the last several years. What has Iran done about it? A big fat nothing. It sat on its hands because it does not want to be dragged into any conflict. So Israel is doing its own thing no matter what, containing what it perceives as a threat to itself and doing what it does, but very much under the radar. But yes, Israel would like to see this regime fall.
But my point is that if he regards Israel and Saudi Arabia as effectively closer friends and allies than he does European countries, we should not be surprised at some point if he does take these sanctions against European companies, because it won't mean anything to him.
Well, that's definitely on the table.
Yeah.
But isn't the problem here as well that, you know, there are wider issues? The problem with asking the question, whose side are you on, US or Iran?
Yes,
is,
I think it's the wrong question.
I have argued already today
That's my role to argue it's the wrong question.
To be fair to Iran, they have up to this point fulfilled the requirements of this narrow but significant deal. But of course, it's the case that they are developing and potentially deploying missiles. They are repressing their people in a sort of clerical-led repressive regime. They are supporting terrorism across the region. These are not good guys in Iran. But Christiane's absolutely right. The way in which you address that is not to throw up in the air the deal that you have managed to deliver up to this point. It's to, you know, if Trump really wants to, if he's happy to negotiate in North Korea, why doesn't he want to negotiate? Actually, he says he wants to meet the Iranian leaders. I'm not quite sure what he wants to talk to them about, but this might be useful. You know,
very quickly, they also have to be mindful of the internal politics in Iran at the moment, where you have to look at what Rouhani says through the prism of those internal politics, and that sometimes he has to say much tougher things publicly than maybe he really believes, because he's got to keep all of the mullahs on side.
How much is our Iranian hardliners, Christiane, rubbing their hands with glee that we've got to this point?
Well, I mean, if only you could just conjure up an image and you'll see these huge smiles by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the hardline mullahs, who, from the beginning, told both Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, and President Rouhani that they were just being patsies, that there was no way that they should trust the United States, because no matter what they did with the United States, it would end in tears. So now they're jumping up and down saying this is exactly what we said, but not just in a ha-ha, we told you so, but the US policy is currently benefiting who? The hardliners, the people who don't want the deal, and the people who are now able to use this US pullout of this deal to not only increase their power and increase their repression and increase their stranglehold on the economy and increase their nefarious activity in the region, but to threaten the so-called moderate reformist spectrum of the Iran politics.
And this doesn't enter the mind of John Bolton, though,
or
does
Donald
it?
Trump.
And we'll talk about John Bolton after a break.
Okay. So it's not the lesson of the last 20 years that you have to be careful what you wish for. If you believe in regime change glibly in other countries, you have to be cautious about what happens if that does indeed take place.
I think that's the big lesson of this.
Well, is it a lesson that John Bolton has learned? Is it a lesson that Donald Trump is even aware of?
We can talk about that after the break, because we'll be talking about John Bolton, the role he's playing. Some of your questions here, Miguel Batista. If Europe wants to keep its credibility as a negotiating partner to the rest of the world, it would have to side with Iran. Iran is just reacting according to US actions, peace above all. And Anthony, gear up for war. Let's hope not. Short break after this. John Bolton. Go ahead.
Do you want to talk about it now? Or?
You can talk about it now and we can repeat it.
I mean, I've interviewed John Bolton a few times, and it's always quite a fascinating experience. I'm sure, Christian, you've done it.
I haven't actually. He stayed very far away from me.
Yeah.
God, I've got one up on you.
For good reason, perhaps.
Come on, spill the beans.
He is a fascinating man, and I have to say he's one of the few people that when I interview them, I'm sort of slightly intimidated by the fact that I'm even talking to him. But he is an irreconcilable. There is no negotiating with John Bolton. He has a point of view, and he will pursue his goal to the bitter end. And that's where I do worry. I mean, if you appoint John Bolton to the National Security Advisor position, you kind of know what you're getting. And
what is the goal, though?
I think with John Bolton, it is regime change. Yes. But that goes against what Donald Trump has always said, that he doesn't want America to be involved in more foreign wars. Yeah. So at some point, something's got to give in that strategy, if it is a strategy.
And I think that's actually interesting, because Bolton is now sort of pushing against Trump in two areas. One, being overly interventionist against Iran, and two, kind of spoiling the sort of diplomacy between Trump and Kim Jong-un. He doesn't want to deal with North Korea.
Yeah. And we saw that today. And some of the comments here: the world cannot afford another senseless war in the Middle East. Impossible to side with the bully, says Kato. If you want a peaceful Iran, overthrow the leaders. So we'll... Welcome back to CNN Talk. We're having a very in-depth and intellectual discussion here about... no, not intellectual.
That's not overselling it.
With in-depth.
Maybe with one panel.
Yeah, let's not oversell it at all.
Stick with in-depth.
And we want to hear your thoughts on this. US versus Iran. Who do you side with? Lots of comments coming in. Enga say I'm on the USA side. Someone thought the B team comments were very funny. Another deflection from problems at home. And neither side. There is no need for this. The nuclear agreement worked well.
Is this even about the nuclear agreement? I mean, the point that we seem to be coming back to continually around this, that the nuclear agreement is a proxy. It's a point of dispute because if you were to go for purely on the factual basis, Iran has stuck to it. It would seem from what the evidence available.
It has.
And
so there is actually no real debate about the agreement, except for the fact Trump wants to rip it up because Obama did it. And then the question is, what is it being used as a proxy for and by whom in the American government? What does Trump want and what does Bolton?
I don't buy the fact that what someone said there, that it's a deflection tactic from his problems at home. What problems has he got at home at the moment? The economy is going gangbusters. He's seen off Mueller. What are all these problems?
That would be Mueller instead of the Mullers.
Pick your Mueller.
Let me bring you this Times quote. This is from the Times. Look, Trump's team shares his animosity. These strategies play well with America's allies in the Middle East. They also represent the single most dangerous near-term threat to world peace. That last line, how... Are we nearing that?
But as we were discussing earlier, you know, there's nothing about Trump's approach so far to foreign policy that looks hungry for military intervention. In fact, his argument has always been, we're not going to be the world's policeman, we don't want to get involved in that. And yet, everything about what he seems to be doing in relation to Iran at the moment, sending the USS Abraham Lincoln, suggests getting closer to that type of military intervention. Is that him, or is that, as we were talking about earlier on, John Bolton?
And is it really?
And before we dismiss, John Bolton and his advisors, and before we say, well, maybe he doesn't want to go to war, which I don't think he wants, Trump, at least from his stated public speeches and things, let's not forget that Bolton, Cheney, Rumsfeld, I mean, you could make a case that back in, 2001, after 9/11, it was the advisors to President Bush that pushed him and started that push towards holding Iraq responsible for 9/11, which of course we know it wasn't, and saying that Iraq had WMD, which we know they didn't. So it's true that Bolton may be acting further than, leaning further over his skis than Trump wants to, but don't underestimate the power of the pressure of Bolton and Pompeo. Pompeo's in it with Bolton as well.
I'm glad you mentioned because he's lost. Because obviously there are no cool heads now around President Trump. We've lost McMaster. We've also lost James Mattis. And I want to bring just a comment from actually John Bolton, who wrote this op-ed in New York Times, Stop Iran's Bomb Iran, in which he said, this is in 2015, the best way to address the Iranian nuclear threat was an Israeli strike backed by US efforts to overthrow the Iranian regime.
Well, the only thing, they tried that way back in President Bush, W. Bush's tenure. There was a thought that maybe this is what was going to happen, and the Americans said, no, we're not going to do it.
But they are asking, are they not giving Iran an impossible ultimatum here anyway? Because ultimately they're saying to them, we're going to ramp up the sanctions, you need to come back with a better version of a deal, which doesn't really exist. So Iran, short of grovelling, which presumably they cannot do with their internal politics, they are being asked to do something impossible. So the end game, such as it's been thought out, has to be one in which something then has to give.
Well, to your point, you just quoted from the Times op-ed, the editorial on this, and the last lines was, reforging a hardline triumphalist Western alliance against Iran may be seen in the White House as one of its greatest achievements. It does depend, however, on Iran choosing to accept defeat. Now, you may still think that that's a possibility, but for 40 years, since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, which is 40 years old this February, it has never surrendered. It didn't surrender when the United States and the whole world was supporting Iraq in the Iraq War. It didn't surrender, i.e. bend over, during the unprecedented sanctions that President Obama put on it and cut the oil by at least half at that time. And it's not going to now. And it's wrong to think that Iran surrendered because of sanctions. It is because Rouhani was elected that they chose a different path.
Yeah. Now, think about the timetable here for a moment,
Yeah.
because in 18 months' time, there's going to be a presidential election. If you are looking at this through a political lens, you may well think, well, let's lead up
18 months' time?
Where? The presidential election.
In America?
Yeah.
Right.
So you've got 18 months to develop your strategy here. If you're thinking about domestic public opinion, you probably, if you are going to have some sort of military action against Iran, you do it probably about 6 months before, because the American people, whatever the arguments about it, they will row in behind it generally. And therefore, he could be carried to victory in a second term on the coattails of a strike against Iran just before that election.
Do you think I mean, we keep using the word strategy over and over again.
What is the strategy?
Is this strategic thinking at any level?
I mean, if you talk to a lot of very serious Iran experts, they believe that this is a policy without a strategy. And the reason they say that is because if it succeeds, what is the plan? To wit, Iraq, right? Yeah. The United States went in, they overthrew, they collapsed the regime there, had no post-war plan, and look at what the landscape looks like nearly 20 years later after the Iraq war. So if they succeed, what is the plan? And if they fail, what is the plan? So no, there's no announced strategy.
And if Iran chooses defeat, Rouhani won't be in power anymore.
I'm sorry to wrap you up. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. We could have spoken about this for much, much longer. From all of us here, thank you very much for watching.